MLB season is back for 2024, and in this video, I'm going to give you an exclusive behind-the-scenes look at the process I use on SaberSim to build my MLB DFS lineups each and every slate. My name is Jordan Chand. I'm the head coach here at SaberSim, and I've been using this process for the past few years, this basic skeleton of a process that I've added on to each and every year here. I've had a profitable season every single time I'm using this process here. What I really like about it is that it is efficient, it is lean, it's easy to follow along, it lets you apply your own research and your own takes very easily, and it leverages our play-by-play MLB simulations and our contest sim simulations very well to help you make educated decisions about how you want to build your lineup. So without much further ado, let's go ahead and dive into my MLB DFS process using SaberSim for 2024. So first things first, where does the process actually begin, especially if you are new to MLB DFS? Coming off of the heels of NBA season, MLB is quite a bit different. We will get starting lineups for teams generally no later than about an hour to an hour and a half before the games start. And generally our predictions on what the starting lineups are going to be are pretty good. All of this is to say, MLB is much less of a sport where you are going to be rushing to rebuild everything when a starting lineup changes the slate completely 10 minutes before the game starts. So I think you can start this process about an hour before the games lock. You'll find most slates, for example, for tomorrow's slate on the main slate here for DraftKings, all of the games on the main slate are locking at the same time. I would expect we'd have starting lineups for these games about an hour before lock, and not much is very likely to change. You can always look for those green check marks as you're used to seeing here, which means that we have the confirmed starting lineup for that team. We've run our simulation that accounts for that confirmed starting lineup. If you are in a situation, especially as we go over the season here, where there is a situation where a team does not have a starting lineup at lock, maybe it's a late West Coast game that the team just doesn't have their starting lineup in, I just like to take note of those teams, that those are teams that I'm going to want to come back and check on later in the slate, maybe an hour and a half before those games start, and make sure that the updating starting lineup is in SaberSim and I've late swapped accordingly. Now, first things first, I always like to do a little bit of familiarizing myself to this slate before I really start building any lineups, just getting a sense of what some of the top stacks are, what some of the top pitchers are, just what the slate looks like overall here. One of the tools that I always like to use to get started with that here is the weather dashboard at RotoGrinders by Kevin Roth. Weather is an important part of your process here in terms of baseball. Obviously, this is a sport that's being played outside. The weather factors as they relate to how players are projected. So when games are in good hitting environments, when games are good pitching environments, things like that is already captured in our simulations that will be accounted for in the projections. But you do want to note when games are at risk of postponement and the players are not even going to play. We certainly don't want that in our lineups, but also delay risks. Delay risks can be useful for pitchers. If a game has a high chance of getting delayed, either at the start of the game or very early on in the game, that does create some downside potential for pitchers. If a pitcher goes out, pitches 2 innings, and then the rain starts coming down, that pitcher gets pulled out. If the game is delayed for an hour or an hour and a half while they wait for the rain to dry up, sometimes the pitcher won't come back into the game. They already got warmed up. They already pitched a little bit. The team doesn't want to get them warmed back up. So there is a little bit of risk for pitchers there. So I typically like to go in here and take a look at the weather situation. I would say I'm very conservative with weather as it relates to MLB DFS overall. I think there are a lot of ways for players to fail. There are more ways in baseball for players to fail for them to be successful. So if you add on the additional risk of weather to what is already just a risky proposition of shooting for any player to be the player you need on an MLB slate, most of the time, I think the right move is to be conservative. So what that looks like in practice for me, anything that's in red on Kevin Roth's weather color-coded system here is just basically the game's already been postponed or it's very likely to be postponed. So you don't need to worry too much about those. I'm generally pretty conservative with players in games that are listed as orange as well. A lot of times I will just X those games off. Again, even if a team's in a really good spot, they're always live to fail. They're often a team that will be pretty chalky anyway, and I'm probably going to want to fade. So all of this to say, I'm pretty conservative with the way I handle teams in bad weather spots in MLB DFS. If Kevin Roth says it's an orange or worse situation, a lot of times I'm Xing it out completely from my pool. Probably the trickiest situations here, and we'll talk about this in future videos as the season goes along, is games that are really on the fence there, where it's yellow, orange, it looks like there's going to be some rain, maybe it is at a pretty good spot, and you really don't want to fade that particular game. Again, I'll do some future videos later as we get into the summer and get into big thunderstorm season in particular about how I handle those situations. But for the most part, I'm generally conservative with weather. So fortunately for opening day here, we don't really have any weather concerns that affect the main slate. 2 games on the early slate that have already been postponed. That slate is likely to just get canceled now that there's just 1 game left on it here. On the main slate, we're looking pretty good here. No real weather concerns. So next up, I just like to take a look overall at the slate and get a sense of what are going to be some of the best plays by projection and upside, and what are some of the best plays or some of the most popular plays based on ownership here. So we'll start by looking at the pitchers. One of the things that I like to do, and we'll refresh projections here real quick just to make sure that I have the most up-to-date projections. When it comes to looking at pitchers, a big thing that I'm looking at right off the bat is what the curve looks like here across pitcher projections. I'm really looking for any particular outliers, guys that really jump off the page as having a particularly high projection that stands away from the rest here, and also extreme value options, just to get a sense of what the slate looks like. For opening day here, and this makes sense if you think most teams are going to roll their ace out, the pitching curve here is pretty smooth overall. We're not seeing a situation where one guy is far and away the best projected option on the board here. We have Skubal and Glasnow, and I guess Luzardo a little bit here that are all this top tier, but you can see it's even hard to break that out into tier. Maybe you could say the top 2 guys are a tier here. But overall, it looks like the pitching projections are pretty smooth, which leads me to think I'm probably not going to want to have too much exposure to any one pitcher, or at least first glance. We'll see how the sims work out on the other side. But that looks pretty flat in terms of the way that those projections look here. So not necessarily something where I'm going to expect to get way over the field on any particular pitcher here. We come over and look at the ownership, and it matches up for the most part here. The ownership following the projections here, which does make a lot of sense, but not a situation where one guy is looking like he's going to be far and away the highest exposed pitcher here on the slate by the field. Looks pretty lockstep in line with projection. So this looks pretty efficient to me right off the bat. I will also take a look at the value options here for this slate and just see what things look like. We do see a little bit of a different picture here when we do flip to the value side. We see Frankie Montas and Josiah Gray, both as pretty good value options, projected pretty well point per dollar against their salary, and look like low owned options here. So maybe some pitchers that I'm a little bit more interested in getting to. They are some of the better point per dollar plays on the board, will let us get up to some more expensive stacks and save a little bit on ownership. So that does stand out as something I like to look at here. For the pitchers, again, really the main things I'm looking at, and this is just to get a sense of what the slate is how it's coming together here, is how does the curve of the projections actually look? Is it pretty linear? Is it pretty flat? Or are there guys that stand way out above the rest? How does that look, especially when comparing ownership? And then are there any point per dollar value plays that really stand out for me? So let's jump over to the hitters here. A couple things that I like to look at. Same thing as the pitchers for the most part here. We'll take a look at the team totals first. I do take a quick glance at the team totals here and just see how teams are being projected early in the season. These team totals do stay a little tame. We're not really going to see 6, 7, maybe even 8-run point totals just yet. When the summer really heats up, you get into some really good hitting environments against some bad pitchers sometimes. You will see teams with a runaway point total or a couple point totals, maybe the Dodgers or the Astros or the Diamondbacks later in the season, especially at Coors Field or a really good hitting park or something like that. You'll get those point totals where they really get high, but pretty flat point totals here on this slate. We see the Dodgers 5.3, the Astros 4.8, Reds 4.7, and then a bunch of teams into those mid 4s, a couple in the high 3s here. So relatively low scoring environments overall, and probably a situation, again, where I wouldn't want to get too overexposed to any one team. If there was a team that looked like they were going to be particularly chalky, it might be a situation where I'm proceeding with caution there. As we look at just the highest projected hitters overall, it does match up here. Dodgers, Reds, you see some of the top hitters on the Astros all jumping out here. Ownership is a huge factor as it relates to hitting environments. So that's a situation that I'm really going to want to look at here. Top owned hitters, we see a ton of Reds, a ton of Nationals here, and then a handful of other kind of more salary relief type players poking their heads in here. A couple Tigers, looks like a Dodgers here as well. So you can start to build in your head what this slate is going to look like for the average player building their lineups here. Probably quite a bit of people going to go to this Reds and Washington game here because they've got a pretty healthy point total on either side. The hitters on those teams are coming in a little bit lower salary, decent average projections. It's going to be a spot people are getting to here, and then fitting in the pitchers that make sense at a salary basis there. It also does make sense why we were seeing Josiah Gray and Frankie Montas here, which with lower ownership, even though that they were pretty good value plays on the pitching side. People are finding it easier, at least just looking at the first glance here at the projections, finding it easier to get salary relief on the hitting side, going to that game in the hitting environment, paying up a little bit more for pitchers. Then they need to go to that game and find pitching relief at salary relief to pay for other expensive stacks. And that kind of makes sense with the story that we're telling ourselves so far here, right? There's not really a team with a run total that is far and away higher projected than everybody else, especially like a team with expensive hitters or anything like that. So you can pretty easily get to the best pitchers, get some salary relief at the hitting spot. So again, just getting a sense of what the slate looks like overall here. So once I start building my lineups, I have a little bit of background for maybe why I'm seeing what I'm seeing and how I want to approach the slate. So let's actually start building some lineups here. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get my contest file loaded here. So I've registered for the $1 150 max, the mini max on DraftKings here. We're going to download that, go ahead and get that pulled in here. And I'm also going to get my contest sim set up now. I am going to be using contest sims here in this part of my process because I'm using contest sims when I'm building my lineups. If you're not on SaberSim Ultimate, I'll give you a couple ideas of how you can do things slightly different here as we go along. But the contest sims are a really powerful tool. They are particularly useful for giving you a really reliable backstop for knowing when you've done too much, because the contest sims will calculate the ROI of the lineups, all of the lineups in your pool. It's very easy to see the impact of the changes that you're making on your lineup portfolio, which I really like. As I start to make tweaks, make adjustments, try to take stands in certain spots, it's nice for me to be able to see the impact on my ROI here. So I'm going to go ahead and get that contest sim set up here, save the settings, and then jump back to the build. And for my first build here, I'm not really going to make any adjustments at all. I'm going to just build some lineups here. I want to see what the simulations are giving me. I'm going to get a big pool of 5,000 lineups that are all the best possible lineup for a given way the slate could play out, and see what we can find here in that pool. Let's go ahead and get our settings pulled up here. The only adjustment I'm going to make here is adjusting this so that it is correctly set for the contest type we're playing, which is a 150 max here. And I'll make 2 changes to player projections here, just so we can abide by the DraftKings rules, and we'll build some lineups. And again, what SaberSim now is going to do is essentially simulate this slate out 5,000 times, giving the best possible GPP lineup for each of those 5,000 iterations. So this pool, we only need 150 lineups, but we're going to build out this big pool of 5,000. We'll then run a contest sim on them and see how they're performing and what we expect this contest to look like. And that's going to give us a really good picture of what our potential lineups look like here. We'll do a little bit of review, see what kind of exposures we're getting, what stacks we're getting to, compare that to our initial impressions of the slate. We'll do some work to diversify, take any stands we want to, and then we'll be done. So we'll give SaberSim just a minute here to finish this up, and then we will keep going forward. Okay, so now we've got our lineups here. So we have our 5,000 lineup pool. One thing to note, again, if you're not on the SaberSim Ultimate plan, you can probably just skip this next step of running the contest sim. By default, your lineups, when they are built, are going to be sorted by SaberScore, which is adjusted for the size of the slate and the size of the contest. What SaberScore basically does is it generalizes the same things that contest sims calculate precisely. So it's going to identify what the best lineups are to play by looking at the lineup's projection, by looking at the lineup's upside in the form of its percentiles, and by looking at the lineup's ownership, a negative factor of ownership here. The Saber scores were back tested using contest sims, so it is still a very good alternative here, a very good placeholder for identifying good lineups. Contest sims are going to be a little bit more accurate and precise at identifying the best lineups from your pool here. So I'm going to go ahead and run the contest sim here, and this is going to take each lineup in our pool of 5,000 here and plug it into what we expect the minimax to look like using the payout structure of the minimax or whatever contest you're playing and an expected field. That expected field is built using an industry aggregate projection, a robust backtesting process that we've done on different contest types to see how players change their lineups they play in single entry, in high stakes, in large field. So we're using a large field contest here as our baseline at the minimax payout structure. So now our contest sim is complete. We can go ahead here, and I recommend sorting by risk-adjusted return on investment. What risk-adjusted ROI is going to do is it's going to take into account both the upside of what happens when that lineup does really well, what is its ROI really as the kind of first part of that calculation, but also the downside. How often is that lineup not cashing? How often are you just losing your entry fee completely there? So risk adjusted ROI is going to be a really good in between of both upside and downside. The next thing I like to do, and this is just to get my build set up here, is I like to create a filter and filter out lineups that are not profitable here. So I'm creating a filter and I'm saying only show lineups where the ROI is greater than 0. And this is just going to eliminate a portion of the pool that I wouldn't ever want to play. So you see it's eliminating about 1980 lineups here. As I start diversifying and making adjustments to my exposures here, I want to make sure I'm only playing lineups that graded out as profitable here. And that's a nice backstop here. That's what I was talking about before with the backstop. It's a nice way to make sure I'm only playing lineups that grade out very well. Okay, the one other thing I like to do as my final setup here before I start actually taking a look and applying any of my stands is diversify. You'll see if we sort by exposure here, we're already reasonably diversified here. Our top exposure in our entire pool is only in 50% of our lineups, but that's still pretty aggressive for a sport like baseball here. I want to diversify one step further here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the min uniques tool, and this is going to make sure that each of my lineups are X players different from each other, where X is the number of min uniques. So right now it's saying each of my lineups in my 150 set must be one player different from each other, which is good. That's a good start. We don't want to dupe ourselves. But what we want to do is we want to make sure that this number is, we want to make this a little bit higher so we can make sure that these lineups are different from each other. So the way I typically recommend doing this, or what I do, is I like to first stress test this and see how high could I actually push it here. So I'm going to try to put this up to say 5 and just see, do I still get 150 lineups back? So SaberSim will process that for a second and we're still getting 150 lineups back. So all I'm trying to do is just figure out what's the maximum value I can actually set this at. At 7, we're still getting 150 lineups back. It goes to show you how diverse our pool actually is here. Let's see if we can go to 8. So at 8, we only get 52 lineups back. So SaberSim is saying the maximum we can diversify our portfolio here is 7 lineups. But if we scroll down and we start going all the way down to the bottom here, we can just drag this down here. You'll see that our bottom lineup now is just a 4% ROI. It's 2793 out of 3090. So to get this diverse, we're playing some lineups that are just barely profitable according to the contest sim. And I don't really want to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop min uniques a little bit lower. And I typically recommend most people go 1 or 2 less than the maximum value you can. 2 less than the max if you're planning on making a lot of adjustments to player exposures. I would go 1 less than the max if you don't have a lot of stands you want to take on the slate. So I'm going to start at 2 less than the max and go back to 5 here. And this is now saying each of my lineups in my pool are 5 players different from one another. So I know my lineups are all very different. They're all grading out as profitable in the contest sim, but they're very different from one another here. Okay, so what we've done so far, we reviewed the slate a little bit here to get a sense of what the slate looks like. We've built our lineups. We built a pool of 5,000 lineups from our play-by-play simulations here. We graded them using the contest sim to see which ones were the most profitable in the Minimax contest. We filtered out lineups that are not profitable in the contest sim, and we've diversified with min unique. So this is the part of the process now where I'll really actually start reviewing and seeing how things are looking and seeing what types of changes do I want to make. I typically take an approach of going right to left with these tabs up here. I think it's just easiest. The rightmost tab here, stack exposure, is the widest angle picture of your lineups. Not looking at any players that are in the lineups, not even looking at any team stacks that are in the lineups, just what's the construction of the lineup is the widest lens that you can take. As you move down to team stacks and individual players, you're looking at more micro levels. So I like to make my adjustments at the widest level first. And even going to the min uniques here, right? That's the widest angle we can take on this as a whole. We're looking at the portfolio as a whole in that case. We're saying, I don't even care what players are in the lineups, make sure that they're 5 players different. So as we're looking at our stack types here, we see right off the bat, generally good looking stacks showing up in our lineup exposure right at the top. We're getting 5 2s, we're getting 4 3s, we're getting the 5 3s, but we are seeing some more unconventional types of stacks showing up in our pool here. We get a 3-2 stack popping into a few of our lineups. We get a 4 stack, we get 3 2-2s. I think there's a couple different ways to take this. I don't necessarily know if there's a right answer. On one hand, we have built these lineups using the play-by-play sims. We've graded them out in the contest sim. And SaberSim is saying that, of our pool, 11% of our 11% of our 150 lineups make sense to be 3-2 stacks. I think there's an argument that those stacks, if they're going to be viable at any time of the year, are going to be viable right now, where team totals are going to be a little bit lower. It maybe doesn't make sense that a 5 stack of any given team is going to be the best way to play the slate. These teams are probably not going to score as many runs as they might as the season heats up here. But for me, often I don't feel like I necessarily need to go so far as to play 3-2 stacks. I think I could probably play stacks that pack in a little bit more correlation into your lineups using 5-3s, 4-4s, 4-2s, and things like that. So I don't know if I need to go all the way down to 3-2. So I'm going to start making some adjustments here to play the stack types that I typically like here. This is something that I do generally, I would say, when slates are 5-6 games or larger. If slates get smaller than that, there starts to be such limited lineup constructions that I'm a little bit more willing to play at smaller stack sizes. But I want to maximize the correlation of my lineups here. So I'm going to eliminate some of these smaller stacks here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to eliminate the lineups that don't at least have a 4 stack and don't at least have 6 correlated hitters. So I'm going to just go ahead and drop all of these off here. So we're going to uncheck those and then click apply. And what SaberSim now is going to do is it's going to find us a new set of 150 where the stack types only fit into these boxes here, while still making sure we're playing the most profitable set of lineups and still making sure we're diversified. We'll go ahead and eliminate those stacks as well, even though there's nothing in our pool here. So you can see we've gotten rid of all of those lineups here. And now if we look at our stack exposures, they're mostly 5-2s, 4-3s, 4-4s, 5, 5-3, and so on. So feeling pretty good about that overall. Okay, and now the next step here is to look at our team stacks overall here. So you can see we are very nicely diversified. This feels pretty good to me right off the bat. We have 31% of the Twins here. That's our highest exposed stack. Then we go to 24, 22, 18 for KC, the Dodgers, and Houston respectively here. So that matches up with the diversification here. I'm feeling good about that overall. One thing that I do really like that I was looking for based on my initial research of the slate here is that we are pretty low on Cincinnati and Washington overall. Those are teams that I think are going to be pretty popular based on our initial research, especially on that red side. 4.7 total. I think some of those hitters are underpriced. That's a team that I'm probably not going to be rushing to make one of my top stacks here. If that makes sense here, that adds up. That's looking good here. One other thing I do often like to look at is just the overall pool exposure. You can use pool exposure as a sense of about how likely that team is to be in the winning lineup or the optimal, the best possible lineup. Your pool of 30-90 lineups in this case here is built on simulations of the slate. So we can use it not only as a way to figure out what lineups do we want to play, but also as a proxy for how often our team's showing up in the best possible lineups. And I like to sometimes sort by pool exposure here and just see if anything's jumping out to me of maybe a team I do want to get a little bit more exposure to. I typically use this to find contrarian plays in my pool here of looking for teams that just other people are not going to get to, or I think are very unlikely that other people get to, that I could maybe get a little more exposure to. A team that does potentially jump up here for me is San Diego. 3.9 run total, but it's a good team. It's a good lineup that they're putting out there, and they're showing up as our 5th most frequently appearing stack, 14.6%. I'm only getting 8% of them right now. I'm glad. I'm happy to have a little bit of exposure there, but that might be a team that I experiment with bumping up my exposure here. I'm going to go look at the individual hitters on that team first, but San Diego does jump out. Even though it's a 3.9 implied run total here, they're showing up pretty frequently in my profitable lineups. So it might be a team I want to get a little bit of exposure to. But for now, I'm not going to make any changes to these team stack exposures just yet. I'm going to jump over to the players tab here now and take a look at my individual player exposures, mostly for the pitchers. I think it's a little bit tricky to look at individual hitting exposures. So I'm going to start with the pitchers here. And again, we're getting a pretty flat exposure here overall. No pitcher showing up in 75, 80, 100% of my lineups, which makes sense. That is what I was seeing in the projections and the ownership itself. I am getting over the field on both Montas and Gray, which were the 2 pitchers that stood out to me in my initial research here, guys that I really wanted to get some exposure to. So I'm pretty happy with that overall. That was the number one thing I wanted to look at for my pitchers, was seeing if I was getting a little bit exposure to the 2 ownership inefficiencies there. And it looks like I am here. One other thing that I do like to look at here, similar to the team stacks, is the pool exposure here. And we'll just bring over that pool exposure, and especially comparing that to the ownership projections, looking for really both directions here. Either hitters that are showing up as being owned way often than they're showing up in my profitable pool. Those sometimes are pitchers that I want to fade even more than I might be getting in the contest sim. Or the other way around, players that are showing up in a lot of my pool that are not going to be owned very much by the field. Again, we're seeing the same thing here. The main standouts from my perspective here are Montas and Josiah Gray, maybe Framber Valdez to a lesser extent. It doesn't look like there's any pitcher that maybe looks particularly over-owned to me in the comparing ownership versus the pool exposure. Maybe Skubal you could make an argument for, but we're already under the field there, and it's still a player that's showing up as the second most likely to be optimal pitcher here based on our pool exposure. So I don't think I'm going to make any adjustments there, just verifying and making sure that I'm satisfied with the way that these exposures look. And I think that's a good way to approach this overall is looking at your exposures, looking at the ownership, looking at the pool exposure, and make sure that your portfolio tells a story that you agree with. The story that I'm getting from these lineups, and it started all the way back when we were doing our initial research of the slate, was that the Reds and Washington look a little bit overowned on the hitting side. Both of those pitchers look a little bit underowned. And the story does not necessarily need to be on every single game of the slate. You don't need to have a stand or a take on every single team, every single game. To me, that's enough. Those two teams, that looks like the game I really want to exploit. And I want to just build in the right pieces around that here over the rest of my portfolio. So one other thing, let's go back and take one more look at that Padres team, because this is interesting to me that they're showing up here as a stack that's showing up in 15% of our profitable pool. Let's take a look at what type of stacks they're really showing up in here. So 5% in the 2 stacks, a handful of lineups in 3 stacks, and a handful in lineups of 4 and 5 stacks. So yeah, they're showing up like across the board in a variety of different stack types here. Let's look at the pool exposure here, not just our actual exposure. Yeah, so pool exposure. So across the board, this entire lineup showing up anywhere from 5 to 10% optimal here. Either their ownership's hovering around 3% or so. This is a team that I want to get some exposure to. I think I'm overall pretty happy with the 15% I'm at here. The situations where I will tend to make some changes, there's a couple situations where I'll actually make changes when it comes to the team stacks itself. The first is if there is a team that's grading out as very high upside based on pool exposure that looks particularly low owned here. A team, if San Diego was maybe showing up in 18, 19, 20% of our pool and was even lower owned than they're actually going to be, it might be a team that I bumped some exposure up even more. The other situation where I'll make adjustments here is accounting for negative leverage. So this slate is one where there's not really a situation on the pitching side where there's a pitcher I particularly want to fade, right? We identified a couple pitchers that I know I want to be over the field on, and we're getting there in the form of Montas and Gray. But there's not really a pitcher that stands out that I really want to be under on. We said Skubal, who I'm a little bit under on already, but I'm still getting plenty of exposure there. We said Luzardo to some extent, maybe looks like, actually, no, I don't think we said Luzardo, but Skubal looks slightly overowned. But we don't have that pitcher that looks particularly overowned. The profile of that pitcher that often jumps out to me as being overowned is the very cheap value SP2. The guy that maybe is not a very strong pitcher in his own, is pitching against a very bad team and is in just like maybe a good hitting and pitching environment for that particular slate. A lot of times those ownerships on those pitchers will get out of control, especially if there is also a very good hitting environment on the slate. Those are situations I often want to target by fading that pitcher and playing the stack on the opposite side. And you'll see as the season goes along, those are also often the teams that will have a very high pool exposure at very low ownership. I'm talking about like maybe the A's or the Rockies, or just not a very good team that is up against a pitcher that's not very good. The field will overwhelmingly gravitate towards playing that pitcher most of the time and avoiding the stack on the other side. That's an opportunity to get some upside there. So in this case, it's really almost the opposite of that. We have a situation where we have two teams that maybe are one bad team and maybe a decent team here in a great hitting environment. And the field looks like they're going to be completely ignoring the pitching side of this game. We go back to the pitchers here and look at strikeouts stats here. We see Josiah Gray and Montas here, 5 and 5.5 expected strikeouts here. So definitely some of that strikeout upside is totally there. If they go out and pitch pretty well, maybe get 5.5, 6 innings, 5 strikeouts, that's probably going to be a pretty good result here, especially for the impact that has on the hitters on the other side. So a lot of times when it comes to what I'm trying to do with these lineups here is look for the 1, 2, 3 exploitable situations on the slate where the field is gravitating very heavily to one side and get a little bit of leverage playing the other side there. So we're very close to done here. One other part of the process that I've recently started incorporating in is a final rebuild of my lineup pool. We have a set of 150 lineups that I would certainly be happy to play right now. We've made all the adjustments that we really want to here. But what one more rebuild does is it lets SaberSim take what we have already inputted into our build. So in this case, for this example, all it was the eliminating of certain stack types. But let's say I had also bumped up my minimum exposure to the Padres or maybe made a couple other changes to player exposures. Rebuilding one more time lets you build a new pool of 5,000 lineups that gives you a sense of that is more fine-tuned to what you're actually trying to do strategically on that slate. I don't like to make those types of adjustments before because as you saw in my process here, I want this first build to be based entirely on the sim so I can use it to look into situations like the Padres, and I can use it to see how the sims are thinking about the slate in an unadjusted way. But now that I've decided how I'm going to be approaching the slate, I've eliminated some stack types I didn't want to play. I've done my due diligence research on a couple other teams. Now I want to actually do one more rebuild and let SaberSim build out a new pool of 5,000 lineups for me where everything is going to be the way I want it to. We have lineups in our pool of 3090 here and our larger pool of 5,000 that are stack types that I know I don't want to play. I don't want to be taking up spots in my pool with those lineups where it's taking away a spot of maybe a different 5-3 stack that is actually would grade out as more profitable if we rebuilt here. So all of this to say, once I finalize my builds and I'm happy with how things are looking, I do one more rebuild here by clicking that rebuild lineups button, and that will rebuild. It won't use any of the stack types I don't want this time around, and I'll get a new fresh pool that I can run the contest sim on. Again, I can diversify again, filter again one more time before I upload these lineups. Okay, so now this set of lineups is finished building here. We have a new fresh pool here. I'm going to rerun this contest sim, pass through all 5,000 of these back through SaberSim here, run it back through that Minimax contest sim, filter those out, diversify, and I should be good to go. Okay, so our contest sim is complete. I'm going to go ahead here and filter again, and we'll go ahead and filter out the lineups that don't grade out as profitable here. And I'm going to diversify again. I will test this out one more time here just to make sure that's still the right threshold. So yes, it looks like actually now 6 is our maximum of number of min uniques here looking at this. And that makes sense, right? 7 is no longer achievable because we've made our lineups be more correlated. So there's less combinations of different ways you can build lineups when you're forcing in more 5s and 4 stacks and things like that. So 6 is our maximum here. Let's look at what 5 looks like here in terms of how low we drop into our pool here. Let's take a look. So our bottom lineup here is lineup 561 here. If we go to 4, we are going to be at lineup 305. Let's take a look at our exposures here one more time and make sure we're happy here. We get up to 50% exposure to our top pitcher here. Our top hitter is at 32% with 4 min uniques. If we go back to our stack types here, our top overall stack is still at 30%. So I'm pretty comfortable with 4 min uniques here. I think there's nothing wrong with 5 in this spot, but I'm going to get a little bit higher ROI out of my bottom lineup by dropping that to 4 min uniques instead here. So I'm pretty happy with these lineups overall. The final step is to go ahead and just load these into my contest here. So we'll go ahead and click Save to Contests, download selected entries, and get these uploaded on to DraftKings here. From there, I am pretty much ready to go. I've got all my lineups here loaded. I'm feeling pretty good about these lineups, and I'm ready for the slate. Now, last but not least, the important final factor here is late swap. Late swap is not going to be as big of a factor in a sport like NBA, mostly because there isn't significant news that's going to come out that's going to completely change the dynamics of the slate. But late swap is still useful. 1, to make sure you're not playing a player that's out. We do want to keep an eye on the slate as it plays out, especially for any of those teams that didn't have confirmed starting lineups when we first built our lineups. We want to come back and make sure that those players are not in our pool. This isn't a perfect example of the slate because for opening day, we have 8 games that are all starting at the exact same time. So we're not going to have a late swap option here. But assuming we did, let's assume that these games were all starting at different times throughout the day here. What we would want to do is, first of all, keep an eye out for any teams that didn't have a confirmed starting lineup when we built our lineups, and just check back maybe 30, 40 minutes before those games actually start. The main things I like to look for is this quick swap, this red lightning bolt that will flash red. If this is turned red, you have a player that is out, that is not in the starting lineup, that is in your entries file. So you can click this here and quickly just swap them out. I like to use best available from the same team to keep my stacks intact. So I'll do a quick swap of all out players for the best available from the same team. If there are any players that weren't available to swap, then I'll swap them for the best available player. And I'll do that here and then re-download that entries file and get that uploaded back into DraftKings. From there, you can then run a late swap here using the late swap button here, which will take the entries file from the contest that you've selected here and allow you to create a new build. This will look exactly like it does before lock, and I typically go through the exact same process to then late swap my lineups if players have been ruled out. The other factor that is important for late swap as it relates to MLB is using our late swap contest sims. Our contest sims, when run on a late swap build, don't just take into account the average projections and the sims of what players were projected to do at lock. They also don't take into account just the field lineups that we were expecting at lock. Those things both dynamically update in real time as the slate is playing out. So let's again assume, for example, let's say for the sake of example that these 4 games all started right at lock and these 4 games were all starting 3 hours later, just as a hypothetical slate here. By the time these games were about ready to start, we would know what had happened in these games, or we would know what had happened. Maybe 4 hours is a little extreme. Let's say these games started 2 hours later here. We would know what the current status of these games in progress were. When you go to rebuild and run your late swap and run a new contest sim on those, rather than just saying we projected Fernando Tatis for 7.5 points at lock, so he's still projected for 7.5 points. If he's gone on to hit 2 home runs and maybe some of our Padres stacks are going off, the contest sim is going to take that information into account when it grades those lineups out and figures out how best to late swap those lineups. So maybe all of a sudden you've got this lineup with a Padres stack in it where your Padres are all going off. Now we can play very chalky Dodgers bats or something like that, or maybe play chalkier players in these later games because we've already gotten a high upside event in the players in those lineups that have already started. So I'm going to, as the season goes on, I'll probably be running late swaps here at most of the game start times. I'll probably group game start times, maybe within a 30-minute window of each other. Baseball is pretty weird where a lot of games will start at different times. You'll have a game that starts at, say, 5 and 5:05 and 5:10 and 5:15. I'll probably group all those together and run a swap for that set of games. But then if there's another set of games that are locking at 6:25, 6:30, 6:35, and 6:40, I'm going to run another swap before those games, even if I don't have players that have been ruled out of my lineups yet, because I want to run a contest sim on those late swaps that takes into account what has already happened in the earlier games. So if I've lost you here a little bit, don't worry. I'm going to record a video in the next couple weeks when we have a slate where late swap is actually going to be useful at all here, walking through that part of my process in a little bit more detail. But if you're on the SaberSim Ultimate plan, taking advantage of those live sims and live field lineups as you're swapping your lineups throughout the slate is going to be a big opportunity for a big edge this year. But that is all there is to it. That is my process laid out step by step, everything I'm thinking about, everything I'm doing, everything I'm making adjustments to, and how my process comes together to build my lineups each and every night. I hope this was a helpful video to get you started for the beginning of MLB DFS season. We do have a free trial on our site at SaberSim.com if you want to come check us out for a free 5 days and get started with our play-by-play MLB sims, our MLB contest sims, all kinds of good stuff there. If you have any other questions, you can always reach out in our Discord server or by emailing us at support@SaberSim.com. And in the meantime, good luck this MLB season. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.